Hello, everybody. Welcome one, welcome all to this week's edition of the Virtuous Insider. So glad that you guys are joining us here today. So glad for those of you that are joining us every week. Since we are doing this weekly, and this is still a little bit new for us here, we are so glad to have you here. Stephanie is already active hanging out in the chat. She is a chatter. Those of you that have been here before know that for sure. We love to have some active conversation going on. It's a good thing. So for today, this session is really aimed at talking about putting strategies into action. And that's a big thing for me personally. I think every time you go to like conferences and you go to like some lunch and learns and you hear some really neat nonprofit strategy ideas, you get really jazzed, you go back to your office and you immediately think, I have no idea how to actually implement the thing that someone just talked to me about, and that kind of bothers me a little bit. I always like to have some practical implementation to go along with that strategy. And so we're talking about that today. Real quick, some housekeeping as we always do. We are recording today's session. We will make it available in the Virtuous Support Center after the session. Everybody, all the attendees are muted. That way we can try to get some good audio. We'll do the best that we can to get some good audio at the very least. And I'm just realizing my audio is a little bit off there. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And if you do have a question, please do send that in at any point. Just use the Q&A feature. While we love a good active chat, it's really hard sometimes to keep track of questions as they fly by there. So if you have a question, just send it in using that Q&A feature. We'll hold those questions and try to make sure that we can get to as many of those as we can. But for today, want to jump right in. You've got a whole crew here today. So I'm Scott Richards. I'm the Director of Training here at Virtuous, and I am joined by Megan Donahue, who is part of the marketing team at Virtuous. How you doing, Megan?
I'm all right. Hi, Scott. Hi, everybody.
And we've got Stephanie with us from our training team. Hi, Stephanie.
Hello, Scott. Hi, everybody.
Yes, we've got full Virtuous team attendance here. So in terms of the agenda for today, we want to do about 30 minutes. We don't want to take up your whole day, but we wanted to talk about some top strategy tips that came out of the responsive weekly discussions. We'll focus in on some of those. And Megan is actually the host and the star of the Responsive Weekly. Megan, I don't know if everybody on the line here or everyone joining us today is aware of the Responsive Weekly or joins the Responsive Weekly. Can you tell everybody a little bit more about the Responsive Weekly and what that is?
Absolutely. So the Responsive Weekly is a two-part thing that happens every week. It is an email that goes out on Tuesdays where we introduce a topic and provide some resources on that topic. And then on Thursdays, it transforms at noon Eastern, into a half-hour Zoom call where we chat about the topic of the day. So it's a community, it's a call, it's an email, it's so many things, Scott. But what it really is a great chance for nonprofit leaders to spend some time with their peers, engaging in the hot topics that we're all facing. So it happens every Thursday. You can subscribe. I'll drop a link in the chat if you're not already subscribed. And I really encourage you to check it out. We're talking a lot, this month we talked a lot about donor retention, but we kind of cover the whole gamut of fundraising, responsive, technology, and marketing topics.
Excellent. Yes, it is a great discussion. It's actually really fun and a really lively session. If you guys get to attend it, it's kind of like watching a talk show. I kind of dig it. So I do recommend it. If you guys have a chance to be able to do that, certainly go ahead and check it out. The things that we're talking about today are some things Megan had highlighted as some of the strategy tips and things that came out of some of those discussions. Okay. And so we wanted to, again, kind of look at those that are a little bit higher level and drill down into how those can apply when you're working in Virtuous day to day. And so we picked out the 3 of those sort of recent topics, and we wanted to drill down a little bit more into some of those. And looks like we've got some, and by the way, I had to use TRW to make it kind of hip. I guess that those of you who used to watch TRL back in the day, that sort of ages me, but there you go. I see everybody in the chat talking about TRW regulars. That's nice. But let's dive in here. So the first thing we want to talk about were some insights that came out of the M&R benchmarks study. And Megan, you guys had chatted a little bit about some of the M&R benchmarks on the Responsive Weekly.
Yeah, we talked about it this morning.
Look at that. That's timely.
Indeed.
My gosh. How did we do that?
Yeah, pretty great. Yeah, for those of you who aren't familiar with the M&R benchmark report, it's a great look annually at what the state of digital fundraising and nonprofit activity is. The report is really fun. They lay it out very well. It is chock full of data, and it's great to dig into. So I encourage you, I'm typing it in the chat right now. If you want to see the whole report, mrbenchmarks.com is where to head.
But I always like that it looks like Mr. Benchmarks.
I love it. I love it so much.
Yes.
Mr. Benchmarks. Yeah, and the news is looking good from the report as far as online giving is up, or was up in 2020. Donors really came through. Also, a lot of evidence suggesting that those smaller donors who've been missing from the conversation for a while now, and we have been worried about that as a generosity crisis, are kind of coming back in. There were a lot of donors, fresh, small gift donors coming to nonprofits last year, so that's great. But one of the things that was really standing out for us here at Virtuous is the role of text messaging. Text messaging is pretty hip. I'm interested to know if anyone participating today is already texting donors, and if so, how it's going. And if you're not, I really encourage you to check it out because the open rates and the engagement rates with text messaging look pretty compelling.
They do. Well, and this is, text messaging is hip. I remember when email was hip and direct mail was dead, and now text messaging is hip and email is dead, and it's not the case, right? Email is not dead as well. It's still a very viable channel. But like you said, when you looked at, and some of the charts that came out of that benchmarking report in terms of text messaging and the metrics there were really great. And the study did go out of their way to say it was very hard to get some clean, definable response rate data for mobile fundraising messages just because of the way the technology works, right? But that you look at the click-through rates, right, for some of those, and they are fantastic. And you compare that to some of the rates that you see for email fundraising messages, and it really does make a compelling message that while you don't want to move your entire digital strategy to text messaging, certainly text messaging should be part of your overall multi-channel approach. Right?
Exactly. And that's what it really is about multi-channel, right? Because there is this temptation that like we jump onto whatever the next thing is and are like, oh, it's only that. Forget everything else we did before. Only this thing now. And instead, if you think about it as a whole range of communication tools that you can use to engage your donors on and offline across channels, text messaging is a tool to definitely fold into the mix. But I wouldn't think of it as a replacement for anything.
100%.
Certainly not for email or direct mail, which both are still pretty important for most organizations.
Oh man, the amount of people who said, hey, direct mail is dead. Let's cut off our direct mail program and just cut off their acquisition at the knees. I mean, I feel like everybody has at least one of those apocryphal stories, but they're true. Like they're out there, and it's terrible. It's an expensive acquisition channel, but it is a really great acquisition channel when you take the long-term view and you look at the lifetime value of those donors. Right? You can't replace direct mail and you can't replace email, but they should all be different tools that you have in your tool belt.
Yes. And then when you know where your donors are and the ways they want to be communicated with, you can be more responsive to their needs and give them more relevant communication, which is great.
1000%. So the thing with text messaging is you can do this in Virtuous. And I feel like this is something that we've talked about a lot lately because some of this is still relatively new in Virtuous, but on the marketing side of things, we do have SMS functionality. When we first rolled out the ability to use SMS messaging in Virtuous, it was a little bit limited in that you could only send SMS messages from an automated workflow, right? So I could build a workflow, and as one of the workflow actions, I could choose to send a text message. Then in sort of the second wave, we started to come out with the idea of being able to do mass texting, right? So I can go out and send some mass texts from here. And I can come in here and either create a template, or I can switch and create a mass text. And when I do that, I can go ahead and give that mass text a name. So this could be my sample text, right? I can choose an SMS template. So those have to exist already, okay? Then I can select that template. It'll give me a little preview of what that looks like. So here's what the preview, here's what the message will look like when it shows up. And then I'm gonna choose a query that I wanna use to send this out, right? And I'm sending this to a group of individuals. So I can use a filter, I can just build the criteria right in here, or I can have a saved query that I want to use. That saved query can be based on anything. If you wanna have the ability for folks to sign up on your website to get text messages from you, and you're gonna actually apply that as, let's say, a custom field on an individual, great, you can have a query that just grabs individuals that have that value, right? Opted into daily list is true or whatever it is. That'll be dynamic. So that query will update as new people match to the query, right? And I can go ahead and set up that mass text. I can schedule it to go out in the future. And then I can go ahead and hit folks with that. Now, a lot of times folks really want to do something like text to give. And when you look at something like text to give, it's really the idea of, hey, text a specific keyword to this text message, and that's gonna pop open a donation form and let you complete a donation. That's something that's still in the future, but in the meantime, you do have the ability to do things like we have in this template, which is to drive someone to a specific donation page or form. And you can even use a link shortener, right, like a bit.ly, to shorten that URL. Make sure you're not taking up too many characters in your text message. And you can use this for actually sending out appeals for support. Now that really works when you have something that is compelling and that is immediate. I think in 2020, there was a lot of that. Text message to me is really great for calls to action for people to mobilize for advocacy or to join you at a particular volunteer event, right? Text feels very immediate. But you can use this for a lot of different ways. To drive traffic to donation forms, to drive traffic to your website, to engage with some more of your content, or as a way to simply thank donors, right? And send them a thank you and have a touch point with them that we know that more donors tend to engage with, tend to open than they do their email, at least nowadays. Okay, so I just wanted to show that off quickly because, for me, it always comes back to showing off the product. That's kind of how I roll. So sorry about that. But I want to make sure we can talk about some of these other takeaways too. And Megan and I were having an interesting discussion even just before we started about one of these. So I want to make sure we have time to get to all of that. And I'm seeing some stuff come in through the chat and through the Q&A, which is great. As you have questions or things that are top of mind, go ahead and drop them in. Stephanie is here to make sure that we can have a nice, lively chat presence, even if I'm busy talking or Megan is busy sharing some of her wisdom with us. But the other thing we wanted to talk about is segmentation and the overall value of segmentation. Am I kind of getting to the heart of the idea there, Megan, or am I off?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were looking at this was kind of the month of looking at reports and various reporting on the Responsive Weekly, because we were also looking at this article from the Chronicle of Philanthropy about 2020 donors and how to engage them. And one of the things that really struck me is that the thing that was that the author was advising was a thing that I think of as like, well, that's always important. And that was using your data and segmenting your donors so that you're communicating to people directly in the way they want to be communicated with, not sending out kind of generic, anonymous mass messaging. Because in our current context of like hyper connectivity and millions upon millions of messages being thrown at your donors all the time, all day long, mass messaging just isn't landing like it maybe used to. So segmentation is one of the ways that you can start directly appealing to groups of donors about what they care about, what's most relevant to them. But you can't do that if you're not taking care of your data.
That is a wonderful point.
Mhm.
I love that. You do have to take good care of your data to be able to segment and to be able to trust it to do some of those things. I didn't mean to cut you off, Megan.
Oh, that's okay.
You made an exciting point and I had to jump in. It's kind of how I roll.
That works for me. No, and I think it is a very important thing to point out that when we talk about segmentation, this is something that really anybody can do.
It is. And segmentation, I think some people think of it as like, oh, that's what the marketing team does, or that's what our direct mail vendor does, right? They have a secret sauce and they got super cool tools and they're going to segment everything and they're going to do all that for us. And that's not my job day to day as a fundraiser. And what you're saying is that's really not true.
Yeah, I think the time is past where only some of our messages should be segmented, but luckily there are tools that make it a lot easier to do this than if you were trying to segment all of your donors using 50 different spreadsheets. Like that would be not fun at all and would be very hard to keep up with. But luckily you don't have to do that. You can use things like tags and keep things up to date and use your entire organization to work together for successful segmentation.
Gosh, I was like, geez, what kind of tools could someone use? I have no idea.
It's so convenient on this call that everyone is a Virtuous customer. It's so
That's right. These are the insiders. This is the cool kids group.
Sometimes I just feel like I'm taunting people who don't have it to just be like, well, this could be useful and there are ways.
Yep. Oh man. Yeah. A wonderful experience like this could be yours, if only. But that's the thing. So the thing to me about segmentation, and you hit it on the head, really is like every message, you should be using segmentation really across the board, right? And I think we talk about it sometimes for like your year-end appeal and your major appeals, but it's really about tailoring your messaging to the donor, to their interests, to the type of donor that they are, and making sure that you're speaking to them at a more personal level and not at a very institutional or impersonal level. And anybody can do that. It's not a thing that only a big organization can do. It's not a thing only the marketing team does. Everybody does play a role. And like you said, a lot of that comes down to things like managing tags and that kind of data. So if we look at, for example, let's look at Iron Man because he's cool like that. If I'm not part of the marketing team, if I'm just I don't want to say just a fundraiser, but you know what I mean? If I'm on the fundraising team, and I don't tend to think of that as being part of my job. One of the ways that I contribute to segmentation day in, day out is simply through making sure that I'm cleanly documenting my activity when I have lunch with a donor, when I meet with them, making sure that I'm keeping that up to date. Making sure that if I have a conversation with a donor and they express a preference for how they would like to be communicated with, what kind of receipting they would like, anything that they're interested in, that I'm adding tags to reflect those things. If I have a conversation with them and they happen to mention that they're really interested in, some of the clean water programs that we're starting to launch, going in and simply adding a tag to note that they're interested in clean water, that's super helpful because later when I go to send out messaging about a new clean water initiative that we're launching, well, then it's easy to target someone who has that specific interest, right? And that's because I happened to pick up that piece of information and I went back and I logged it. And even other things that we don't think about, like making sure that we're tracking event attendance. Right? You might not be managing your events through Virtuous. Maybe you're using another system, using Classy, right, to manage your event. Who knows? But bringing that data over and importing that to know, well, how frequently does someone attend some of our events? If it was a third-party event, still getting the list of those folks and knowing who's attending those events, who's participating, that's gonna factor into the types of messages I'm sending to somebody and how I'm talking to them, because I know how involved they are and I know how they like to get involved with my organization, right? And so all of those things are part of segmentation. Then you do have the folks who are going to take all that data and are going to either build queries on that, or if it is your mail house, they're going to do some really super duper fancy analytics. But everything that we contribute day in, day out, that we just think of like kind of, oh ho hum, that's just what I do in the CRM, all of that is playing a role in segmentation.
Absolutely.
I want to get to the interesting one. Not this isn't interesting, but you know what I mean. Come on, guys.
Now we debate.
We were having a really interesting discussion about this before, and other folks might have some different perspectives on this, but we were chatting about specifically retention, and not just retention. I mean, retention is important, and I think anything you read about nonprofit and fundraising nowadays will talk about retention, but really, do you have a strategy for retaining your 2020 donors? And looking at those 2020 donors is sort of a unique group. And what we found out right before this is that Megan and I have some differing opinions on this topic. Yes. So Megan, what was your take? Let's start there.
So anyone who was at the Responsive Weekly a couple of weeks ago when Brian Funk joined me to talk about retaining 2020 donors knows that we had a fairly robust discussion about whether we are dealing with disaster donors or not, like the kinds of donors who give in the face of an earthquake or other kind of natural disaster. And we had some reasons we thought probably not. We thought that the crisis last year was too ongoing to be considered the same as a disaster. We thought that the fact that giving was going across multiple sectors was interesting because it's not like all of the country united and contributed only to the CDC Foundation or some very COVID specific thing. We saw stuff going with poverty alleviation, homelessness organizations, health and human services, a lot of stuff was up. And then the other thing that really struck us as different and struck me as different is usually in a disaster scenario, the people who are not affected by the disaster are the people who give, right? Like, I was not hit by the tsunami, therefore I will donate towards tsunami relief. But with COVID, everybody was affected. Everybody on earth was affected. So there's not that clear line of people dealing with the disaster versus donors helping with the disaster. So we thought that made the 2020 donor a little different. But Scott had a different idea.
I did. Yes, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who is a fundraising consultant. And we were talking specifically about retaining 2020 donors. And we kind of landed on the opposite side, that when you look at 2020 giving, it really is like disaster giving. And I don't know why my go-to disaster, which is a weird thing to say out loud, is a tsunami. Whenever I talk about disaster giving, I talk about like tsunami relief. But that it is something on par with that, because it was a compelling reason to give, especially to health and human services orgs. And also that a lot of people were stuck at home and felt like they were helpless and they needed something to do and they needed some way to make things better. And the one thing they could do is they could go online and they could make a donation somewhere. And I think that what we kind of talked about, because Megan was making her case to me and I thought it sounded really good, and I was making my case to her, and I was starting to get less sure of things. But I think the thing is that you have to look at donors who were acquired in 2020, I think, more as tending towards that disaster relief side of things, or, hey, there was an overwhelming, compelling event that forced them to give. And so if you acquired someone in 2020, and Megan, I think you said it, like, you've got a lot to do to still introduce yourself to that donor. And you can't necessarily retain them like you would someone who kind of understands the value of your mission. But if someone was already a donor on file prior to 2020, and they still gave in 2020. Those seem to me like the folks who are committed to your org and to your success. They wanted to see you continue to thrive even amid everything that went on last year. And those are the folks that I think, when you approach them to retain them, your messaging should still be very grateful and thanking them for their ongoing service. But I think that you don't have to do the same amount of heavy lifting to retain that group of donors.
Yeah, that seems likely to me.
And I'm wondering, I don't see anything going on in the chat, so I'm going to assume everybody agrees with both of us.
Well, I was thinking about it in terms of like, it would be interesting. Stephanie's on my side. I was thinking like, this is an interesting question, but it might not change too much of what we do, because the fact is that retaining any new donor, any first-time donor, is already a pretty heavy lift. Right? Because we know that most first-time donors don't give again. So
yeah,
it may be whether they're a disaster donor or something else, that your course of action should probably be kind of in the same ballpark of engaging them where they are, trying to learn more about them and listen to what's interesting to them, and providing those points of connection and education about, this is our organization, this is what you're part of, this is what we can do together.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think the big thing is it's more the content of the messaging is a little bit different, because like you said, right, you've got to kind of introduce yourself to those folks all over again. And I think we tend to fall back on, well, I've just got to like find a compelling way to make my case statement. And to me, when I talk about doing that, either to acquire new donors or in something like this, it's less a matter of like, here's my case statement, but it's more, hey, why is our mission important, and why is it relevant, and why does it matter? And that's a message that everybody, I feel like, did a lot of work to refine last year. Like you look at an arts organization who was forced with having to communicate, why are they still valuable in the face of this overwhelming disaster, right? A lot of people had to go and do that kind of work. So to say, hey, look, why is my mission compelling, and why is our organization uniquely suited to address this need, right? To serve this mission, and like you said, and how can we work together to do that, as opposed to a message that is more focused on thanking the donor for their gift and communicating the impact of what you've done together. I think the message for those newly acquired 2020 givers is more forward looking than that. I think that's really it. And I see I've got somebody on my side, so that's good. Thank you, Evan, for having my back.
Evan did make a very good point. I know. See, this is going to, by the end of it, everyone will be on everyone's side, and we'll all just have to wait and see.
Oh man, I'm so tempted to, I thought it'd be a music theater joke, but we shouldn't do that. So real quickly, I did want to tie this into the product. We could do this for the whole half an hour, should have done that. But in terms of measuring retention and looking at retention data, and we talked a little bit about this in a previous insider session. We talked about retention reporting. But if I very briefly just want to know, hey, who is it that gave in 2020 that hasn't given this year? Am I retaining those donors? Don't forget that in the query tool, if you go to the best practice queries, right, there is a Libunt best practice query that is built into the system that simply looks at everyone who has given at least one gift in the previous year who has not given so far this year. That's a very, very simple way to look at those folks and see, hey, who is it that I'm not retaining right now? If instead I want to go, I'm losing my mouse there. If instead I wanted to go a little bit further and say, let me find everybody, as we mentioned, let me find everybody we acquired last year and start to look at of those folks that we acquired last year, just who are they? Who is a new donor in 2020, and how many of them, if I want to spin it forward, have given so far this year, right? I can do that from a contact query, right? Because I can look at everybody whose first gift date, oh boy, I've got a really clicky clacky keyboard today. This is great. First gift date overall, right? And we can just do between, so we can look for everybody whose first gift date was last year. So that gets me everybody that we acquired last year. And then from there, if I wanted to focus in on the folks who have given a gift so far this year, right? I could do that. So their last gift date overall, right? Let's say is greater than or equal to 1/1/2021. That would get me everybody who was a newly acquired donor in 2020 who's given so far this year, right? And then of course I could look at everybody whose last gift date overall was less than or equal to December 31st, 2020 to find the folks who have not given yet this year. So that would be the reverse side. And then for each of those two groups, again, my messaging might be slightly different. Okay, I know we're at time. We do this every time. We'll get better at it. We're working on it, people. We're trying anyway. But there is so much to say. We had some questions. I think Stephanie addressed all of those because she's on the ball like that, which is awesome. And so that is great. And she's also had some nice tips in here. For example, copying best practice queries. I do want to make sure that I remind everybody, please do join us next time. We are going to be chatting with Jason Van Loo, our Director of Product. It's going to be our Product Pulse discussion, looking at what new features have been released. We do have an update, a release coming next week. We'll look at some of those new features and also a peek into the future at what's coming on the platform, and an opportunity to ask some questions and find out about the direction of the product for sure. And as always, I like to leave you guys with some words from someone smarter than me. And this is from Peter Drucker. He's you might like him, might not. He's got some good ideas, some ideas that are, I don't know. But this one was really great. And this one kind of, to me, this always speaks to, again, my feeling on those sort of high level strategy discussions. Megan even mentioned it today. Right, we got into this big debate about retaining 2020 donors, and Megan said, "Well, does it really change what you do? Right? You know, what's going to happen? What's the implementation?" And this really hits that on the head. Right? Plans are only good intentions unless they immediately degenerate into hard work. Strategy is awesome, but how are you going to put it into practice? That's what's going to move the needle. All right. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Stephanie, for keeping the conversation going. Thank you, Megan. We love having you come join us for these. We have to do it more often.
Always a pleasure.
Awesome. And we will talk to you guys again next week. Bye, everybody.
Bye.